New details revealed in court this week about the case against Florida neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman. Zimmerman is charged with fatally shooting an unarmed teenager, Trayvon Martin. Now, at Zimmerman's bail hearing yesterday, the defense said Martin's death was, quote, of his own doing. However, police records show the detective who was first on the case and investigated was not convinced that Zimmerman's actions were justified. But that officer has been pulled from the investigation and is now in uniform on the graveyard shift. Let's get right to our legal panel. Robert Schalk is a defense attorney. David Schwartz is a former prosecutor. Robert, let me start with you. A person who uses deadly force must reasonably fear that his life is in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death. That, as you know, is a subjective standard which the jury will determine. It's the ultimate issue of fact. Thus, I don't think the detective would ever be allowed to offer his opinion on that ultimate issue of fact, that he didn't think that Zimmerman was justified. The judge is going to say, sorry, that's for the jury to decide. You can't tell them how to decide.
Right, but the prosecution would do everything they could to make sure that the detective's investigation was brought forth and was abundantly clear his opinion. But again, questions can be asked, and the defense attorney has every right to object to those questions. But why are you demoting the one person who said we should arrest this individual, we should charge him with manslaughter? It makes no sense.
You sure it was a demotion that was forced on him because the spokesman for the police department says he wanted it, it was his own choice, Robert?
There's no way I believe that statement, that a 15-year detective who's investigating potentially the most important homicide investigation in the state of Florida is just going to step away.
It seems odd, I will admit. Now, David, an unedited version of the detective's sworn statement shows that he thinks the injuries were, quote, marginally consistent with a life-threatening violent episode. Isn't that good enough under the deadly force subjective standard as I described it?
Yeah, no, it certainly would be good enough under the deadly force subjective standard. But again, the investigator's comments are not going to come in as to what he thinks. He's not an expert as to these injuries. So, you know,
his opinion is irrelevant. It's inadmissible.
But the case is going to rely on what the jury decides, not what this detective decides, what the jury decides.
Robert, you can see that I'm going in the direction of David here. Give me your counter argument.
I got you. Well, listen, you have a scenario where the detective was the only person in the police department that wanted to effectuate an arrest. And the people are definitely going to make every attempt to make sure that they outline everything he did with regards to his investigation.
But Robert, it's like saying, well, the jury gets to hear whether the detective thinks the defendant is guilty. That's never admissible.
No, it's not. That's never going to come out. Obviously,
well, that's what this is.
Correct, but you have a situation of a detective who now, you have to assume now that the George Zimmerman defense team is going to have so much fodder with this demotion. He's now going to be lumped in with the exiled police chief as almost part of the problem when he was part of the solution for the prosecution.
You know what? We have now a transcript of the police interview that Zimmerman did that night, the reenactment the next day on videotapes, a plethora of evidence. And David, there's something interesting, too. It's the physical evidence. Gashes, a broken nose, bruises on the head of Zimmerman, and a paramedic's going to say his entire face was covered with blood. Wouldn't that physical evidence tend to corroborate the defendant's story?
And that's what's going to come in, is the physical evidence, not the detective statement. So, yes, absolutely, that type of physical evidence will go towards the justification defense, in this case, will lay into the self-defense. So the defense is going to have to lay all those facts out, and a lot of those facts they'll be able to bring out through the people's witnesses as to what happened.
And, Robert, something else we learned yesterday for the first time, at least in terms of testimony, the father of the defendant is prepared to get on the witness stand and say, look, I know my son's voice. That's him screaming for help. And apparently, there's an eyewitness who's willing to corroborate that, you know, he was being beaten on the ground and that Trayvon Martin was on top of him.
Zimmerman's defense team can't ask for anything better than that eyewitness corroborating the father's statement. Obviously, the father's going to come in and protect his son. That's an easy argument for the prosecution to make. But when you have independent eyewitnesses who have nothing to gain or lose from testifying in a criminal case, there's nothing better for that defense team to have that individual come in and corroborate what Mr. Zimmerman's going to say.
All right, Robert Schalk, David Schwartz, thank you, guys. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So drinking coffee may do more than give you a little pick-me-up.